I just want to preface this by saying, we're recording this discussion at a unique moment in history. The world is struggling to address and contain a pandemic which continues to touch the lives of nearly everyone on the planet. In the US, the virus has more significantly affected marginalized populations, which include people of color, immigrants, refugees, and undocumented citizens. These populations are more likely to be essential workers, and due to less access to adequate health care, they typically suffer from untreated and chronic health problems. Also in the US, while this pandemic has been raging, the death of yet another unarmed Black man at the hands of 4 police officers in Minneapolis was captured on video and has sparked nationwide protests that seem to be gaining strength. Protests, as well as the violent response and tactics used by the police against peaceful protesters, have brought into focus the unequal treatment and abuse of power for which police are known in communities of color across the country. So my last question here is, in what ways does Vargas's book, one about belonging and the idea of citizenship, speak to the current moment?
So I think when we talk about the systems in place, we touched on that briefly in our discussion. We talked about the history briefly, throughout this discussion. We talked about being willing to gain more knowledge so far in this discussion. I think all of those things tie back to this time where a lot of the things that we're seeing happening within the US, across the world, as it relates to immigrants, refugees, people of color, those populations have been disenfranchised by the system. All of it is tied to the history. So I will put it out there that I'm an immigrant woman myself, and I came here studying the history of this country, and know that a lot of these systems are in place that have contributed to, the higher percentage of the population who are affected by this virus. I know that the history of this country is also tied to the treatment that some communities of color and undocumented individuals faced by folks in authority in this country, and so tied to this idea of citizenship, and belonging, as the writer says. I'll tie it directly to this, directly to protesting, we'll say. As citizens documented in many states or cases, with all the protesting, protest is a way that folks can communicate and make themselves known, and make their discontent known, with the current systems that are in place. That is actually a privilege that isn't afforded to many individuals in the same way, because as an undocumented individual, if you want your voice to be heard through protesting, and you're in the wrong place and wrong time, and you're in a brown body, you have to worry about your safety in a different way, and so all of it is wrapped up in this big complicated ball that's tied to American history, that affects how people feel in this country, whether or not they belong. And then one thing I will say that's a little bit straying from this, but differences exist in many ways for all of us. But one of the things that definitely came to my mind as I thought through this whole pandemic, before we even got as far as, the murder of another unarmed Black man, was folks in general were really concerned about, if they were coming internationally and were stuck in one spot and not able to see, a family member abroad because of this pandemic. You're in one spot, you're locked in your state. So let's say you're in, your state is on lockdown, you can't go see your family in another state, or America's on lockdown, you can't go see your family members abroad because flights aren't going from place to place. I have thought of it as a small window into the reality of undocumented individuals who go many years without ever seeing their family members. So you think of the author who, by my count, is now looking at 27, 28 years since he's seen his mother. And so even within this season of coronavirus and this pandemic, and with some of these restrictions to movement and going from place to place, there's still some privilege that exists in that, because there's an end to it. There is a countdown to the next phase when this restaurant opens or travel resumes. But for folks who are undocumented citizen, there is no timeline. It's not, there isn't a fix. And I think those are the words of the author as well. You can't just fix it. A lot of conversation comes up about, well, why don't you just do it the right way or do it a particular way? There is no quick fix. And so, yeah, that's what I'll stop there. That's what I really wanted to say about this. There's again so much that we could go into with this discussion.
Yeah, and a lot of what I wanted to say is directly related to Dean Hunter's remarks, and I agree with everything you've said. And I hadn't thought about it the way in which our experiences right now, or when you're in a state that there's been a lockdown, how that relates to the experiences of Jose Antonio Vargas having not seen his mother. And when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking back to what you said about what citizenship means and what he means by the term undocumented citizen, which is directly related to the current moment. We need to remember that the book focuses primarily on the experiences of undocumented citizens and documented folks, and particularly the lived experience of one. And the people he interacts with. But within that, he also, going back to the conversation about history, he links his experiences to the histories of Spanish and U.S. colonialism. He links it to the construction of race and anti-blackness. He links it to the simultaneous demonization and marginalization and exploitation of migrants and folks of color. So he makes those links in the book for us. And we need to explore those even further. So the central question of what it means to be a citizen and the historical framing of this then is directly applicable to the continued oppression of communities of color and the articulation of anti-Black rhetoric and systemic racism. It is a system, and Jose Antonio Vargas is within the system and suffers from the system, and this is another system of systemic racism and anti-Black rhetoric and violence that is oppressing folks in the United States. It's long been evident that citizenship, quote unquote citizenship, when we define that legally, that doesn't bring with it equal treatment by law enforcement or equal treatment by the courts. And so the question is, why is that? And what does it mean? Like when folks come over and say, "Oh, you should just get legal to as Vargas tells us, right? Is it good?" And he says, "Well, I can't even do that. How? There is no queue to get to the end, to get to the back of." So for him to be a citizen is to recreate the notion of belonging and redefine the notion of belonging. And if we are going to create a system where folks are treated with dignity and with respect, regardless of their race and ethnicity, that is, when folks are treated as people who belong, then we have to redefine the system, right? And these are questions. I was doing a little bit of research, and Vargas he engaged with these. He's an activist. He's a journalist still, and he's engaged online with these questions, and he's been involved in discussions about COVID-19 and how it's affected migrant communities and communities of color. He's been involved in discussions about racism and anti-Blackness in different communities in the US, about the dangers faced by undocumented folks, as you mentioned, if you go to a protest, what the privileges that go with having certain types of documentation. So overall, I think we need to think about and reflect on the multiple kind of systems of exclusion, oppression, and violence that see children locked up on the US's southern border, that see Black and brown folks disproportionately affected adversely by COVID-19, that see queer and trans youth and queer and trans folks of color marginalized, policed, assaulted, and murdered. And as we reflect on these structural inequalities, then we need to ask ourselves who it is that defines these notions of citizenship and belonging, and what we all must do to make a positive change. And so Vargas structures it, and I'm not giving anything away, but he structures his book in like 3 different sections: lying, passing, hiding, all of which are terms that we can often associate with oppression, with being undetected, right? Or attempting to do that. But then he asks us as readers to participate and bring about change, so those terms don't need to be applied. And then the question that this current moment poses is very similar, albeit a very different context. How can we bring about change? And what are we each going to do to bring that change around?
All right, I think that's a good point to end on, Professor Humphrey, Dean Hunter. Thank you both for joining me to discuss Vargas's interesting book, Colgate's Summer Reading. I also want to say to all of the students that are out there tuning in and checking this out, so you get a sense of what's in store when you start reading Dear America. The entire Colgate community is looking forward to having you join our vibrant intellectual community in the fall in one form or another, and having you add your voices to conversations like this. We're planning a couple of book club style Zoom discussions of the book during the summer that have yet to be determined a date and time. But stay tuned. Pay attention to your emails that you're going to be receiving from the Office of Admissions and the engagement committee that's been reaching out, and you will find out when those are going to be scheduled. Those will be faculty-led, staff-led, and so we encourage you to do the things that will keep you and your family safe and healthy. And please enjoy reading Dear America.